Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you like it, hit the thumbs up for me. In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove and install the front wheel on your Ducati. It's pretty much the same on all of them. So first thing we do is we're going to loosen our axle nut. And once the axle nut is loose, then we need to loosen the pinch bolts at the bottom of the forks. There are 4 hex head bolts at the bottom of the forks that need to be loosened. This is a pretty easy process. Make sure you get about 3 or 4 turns on each of these pinch bolts, especially the first one. If you don't get enough turns on the first one when loosening it, when you loosen the second one, the first one will end up tightening up on you. So always good to get an extra turn or 2 out of it. And once we got those pinch bolts loose, we can go ahead and pop our bike back up on the stand, and then we can start working on our calipers. So removing the calipers is pretty straightforward. What I typically do is break free the bolts first, and then I remove them. So I loosen the first one, and then loosen the second one, and then I start taking them out. I don't take out the first one and then take out the second one. So when I take the caliper off of the rotor, I do give the caliper a slight little twist, just enough to push the pads back into the caliper, push those pistons back into the caliper. It makes it easier for the caliper to slide off of that rotor, and it gives you a little bit more clearance between the caliper and the wheel. The last thing you want to do is knock your caliper into the wheel and chip some paint. Most Ducati owners, that would just make them cry. So I don't want to see none of y'all cry or whining at me on my YouTube page because you whacked the wheel and took out a big chunk of paint. So again, we just give it just a little, kind of a little twist, and then the caliper just comes out of the way. And you always want to check your pads. These are new EBCs, and I also have Galfer lines on this bike. So that's why the lines are red. And then this axle is a little bit tight to get out, and that just tells me that whoever had the bike before I got it, when they changed the tire, they decided it wasn't a good idea to use a torque wrench on those pinch bolts. If you don't use a torque wrench on the pinch bolts, you kind of warp the axle a little bit, and it makes the axle hard to get out. And I can usually tell, especially on a Ducati, when the axle is just not round. So now we're putting the wheel back on the bike. I've got a new set of Bridgestone S22s, and the first thing I want to do is clean up the seals, the wheel seals, and I'm going to put a light coat of grease inside those wheel seals. And I use Lubrimatic marine grease because we're not lubing anything. We just want to make sure that dirt, debris, and any water or moisture does not get into the wheel. So I use Lubrimatic. I clean up the spacers, put the Lubrimatic on the seals, and that marine grease does a great job of keeping the inside of the wheel clean and well lubricated. You know, if it's good enough for your boat trailer, it's more than good enough for your Ducati. So this is the small seal here, and I'm just wiping it down. The small seal typically is on the right side. The big seal is on the left side. And then now we're going to coat this axle with some Lubrimatic grease. So it's a good idea when you're greasing the axle, you know, do a quick inspection. If you have any really dark spots on the axle, that's a kind of a good warning that you have a bearing that's going. Usually if a bearing's starting to wear out, the wheel might turn on the axle and it'll burn into the axle, and you can catch it before it does any damage or crashes you going down the road. So then I just lift the wheel up and push the axle through, and you see once I get it lined up, on a good Ducati, on a Ducati that's like right out of the factory, that axle will come right out and it'll go right in, and there's no need for me to take a hammer to get the axle to go back in or to come out. So once I've got the axle in and the axle nut on, I want to go ahead and tighten down this axle. Usually I just go finger tight, but you kind of missed it. I wanted to line up the axle. There's notches in the right fork that the axle kind of lines up with. I attempted to do that, and because the axle's a little bit warped, it stuck. It got tight in the fork, so it wouldn't turn freely. So it kind of looks crappy to me. But in 1,000 miles, I'll be doing this job again when these tires are worn out. So I'll straighten it up and make it look better in the next video. So once we have our caliper bolts back into place and our calipers on, we want to go ahead and torque these down. And I don't give torque specs in my videos, but it's the same torque specs for most of these Ducatis. This bike pretty much goes together just like the first 916, 996, 998. My 848's pretty much this same bike, putting it back together. There's not a whole lot of difference between the bikes. But again, if you look at the axle, those notches are kind of a little bit offset of vertical in that front fork, and you can see that notch at the top of the fork where I would have liked to have those notches straight up and down, and I was unsuccessful. A good mechanic would have taken the nut off and knocked the axle out about 1 inch and put a screwdriver on it and turned it, but I'm not that good. So now that we've got our calipers torqued down, we want to spin the front wheel, and when the axle's not tightened and torqued down like I have it right now, you can actually spin it and grab a handful of brake and it will align the front end for you. And then when you spin that front wheel, you'll hear it. It'll spin freely the way it should. And once your calipers are done and you're done spinning the wheel, drop your bike off the stand and then torque down your pinch bolts. So you want to torque down the right side first, and then you want to go over and torque your axle nut. In this video, I skipped that stage because my axle nut is already torqued down. I did that while I was trying to spin that axle. Like I said, I was trying to spin it in the fork unsuccessfully. And when I tighten down these pinch bolts, I usually do the outside first, then the inside, then the outside, then the inside, then the outside, then the inside. So I put a torque wrench on each one of those bolts 3 times. And you'll see as you do it, when you do the outside and it gets to the proper torque, and then you do the inside and it's at the proper torque, the outside is now loose. So then you're going to do the outside and it'll click, and then you do the inside, it'll click, and then just come back and hit both of them one more time to make sure that the proper torque is on them. So like I said, right now is when I would torque down that axle nut, but it's already on there tight. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up with torquing down these pinch bolts, and this job will be done. I will tell you that I took this bike out for a 200-mile ride about an hour after I put these tires on, and the S22Rs are the perfect tire for this bike, the perfect tire for my 848, and I'm thinking I'm going to put them on one of my VFRs, and just I know it's going to be a perfect tire on the VFR, because it's hard to put a bad tire on a VFR. But the Michelin tires I did take off this bike were just terrible. Thanks for watching my video.